to summarize today, to understand the segregation in the region by class and by race and ethnicity, one part of that is that we need to understand that cities and towns have adopted policies that keep certain groups of people out of certain suburbs and neighborhoods, shutting those people out from certain public benefits of the suburbs, such as excellent schools and safe streets and well-maintained infrastructure. That's my tale of two cities as it relates to zoning policy.
I am going to kick off tonight's conversation. Tonight's conversation is really focused on the intersection of housing, transit, and density, and is special in part because it's being hosted by Great Neighborhoods. For those of you who aren't on the Livable Streets or Massachusetts Smart Growth Alliance listservs today, you may have missed an announcement that Great Neighborhoods is actually going to be joining Livable Streets as a program. So our co-host is going to become part of Livable Streets in just a couple of months. And, we could not be more excited about this merger. So I would say if you don't know much about Great Neighborhoods, please check out the website and learn a lot, because we're planning on doing great things in the year to come. But tonight we're going to talk about sort of how we got here and where we're going. We cannot talk about transportation like we did in the last 3 street talks without talking about these issues of density and housing. We often hear a myth that, the ills of dense urban settings are emerging again, as they did in 9/11 or during the 2008 economic crisis, or countless other crises where naysayers claimed that, this crisis will spell doom for cities. We know that's not true because we've been through this before. But what we also know is that it's not as simple as density is good or bad. The questions we are unpacking tonight are really, what have we gotten right? What have we been getting wrong? And how do we move forward in a future, in a community that's sustainable? And these are questions that are relevant in Boston, in our suburban and urban areas, and in every community across the country. So I have 2 amazing speakers joining us tonight. I have Wendell from Sasaki, and I have Amy, who is a policy and research consultant. They're both amazing experts. And I'm going to direct my first question to Wendell to help set the conversation up for us. And the first question I just want to dig into is, can you help the audience unpack the difference between crowding and density? We've been seeing these issues sort of used interchangeably. And I just want you to help understand, what are the factors of density that are public health risks that we might want to be concerned about versus some of the real benefits that have helped communities in this time of crisis. So Wendell, share a little bit about yourself and take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Stacy. It's a pleasure to be part of tonight's discussion. Real quick before I answer your question, I'll just share a little bit about myself. For those who don't know me, my name is Wendell Joseph. I am an urban planner at Sasaki Associates. Sasaki is a 65-year-old award-winning interdisciplinary design and research firm based in Watertown, Massachusetts. The firm's practice comprises a number of different disciplines, including architecture and interior design, urban planning and urban design, and landscape architecture and civil engineering. And, our work spans different client sectors, including commercial, civic, as well as cultural, and also campus. That's the third one. And we do work at the international and national scale. So please check out, our diverse portfolio at Sasaki.com. That's SASAKI.com. I also want to give a quick shout out to the Sasaki Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization founded almost 20 years ago that really complements the work that Sasaki as a firm does. The foundation does a lot of work underwriting community-driven actionable projects with professionals across the region. They do work with high school students over the course of the summer, and they also host a number of speaker series throughout the year. So check out the Sasaki Foundation work that they do at sasakifoundation.org. With that, I'll jump into my take on density and overcrowding. As you mentioned, Stacy, density it's an age-old conversation in cities. In fact, I was doing some reading recently, and the article that I read, they had an excerpt from Thomas Jefferson. And as early as 1800s, the 1800s, Thomas Jefferson was talking about cities, and at the time he called cities a pestilence on, the morals and the health of people, which I thought was a bit dramatic. But I mean, it's again this age-old discussion about density and whether it's a good or bad thing. I think it's a very it's not black and white. I mean, I think at a very, very high level, first of all, density is really the number of people living in a geographic area, right? So it's X amount of people per square mile, for example, or square kilometer. Density is a very important metric for cities of any size to keep track of, because density does have an impact on it. It does influence decision-making processes and planning processes that determine where public and private investment goes. So, that's why it's an important thing to keep track of. What I would also say about density and where we go into this question of overcrowding, I think it's really a question of capacity. And so I think capacity, on the one hand, is the sum total of whatever resources, assets, and infrastructure a city may have. And it's also the ability of a city to effectively, efficiently, and sustainably provide basic services and meet the basic needs of its citizens. And so with that in mind, I think density and overcrowding are not, they're not value neutral terms. It is extremely, extremely contextual. And to just say this thing is bad, I think you got to be very, very careful. I think you have to be, again, extremely aware of what your city's capacity is to be able to meet the needs of its residents. If you have a city that's super dense, in that it has a lot of people in X amount of square footage, but it has the capacity to meet all of their needs, it has the capacity to provide basic services, then is it really overcrowding? Maybe, maybe not. And so I think, again, it's very, very, very nuanced. With that, I think there are a lot of benefits of density, as we know. I mean, it's an opportunity for people to connect and interact with each other. People living in close proximity to each other, it facilitates learning and interaction between people, which is really important in terms of developing human capital, developing social capital, which is a huge plus in cities, exchanging ideas, exchanging information. We learn together, we grow together, good things. I think some of the things that we've also seen in cities during this pandemic are how they're adjusting to life at home, adjusting to isolation, and trying to think of creative ways to accommodate people in their various lifestyles. So there have been plenty of cities across the country, across the globe, that have actually started to close down city streets to create more space so people can go outside, stretch their legs, but still practice social distancing protocols. We have some examples of that here in Boston, where DCR has closed some streets across the Boston metro region. There's already precedents for this in Cambridge. DCR has I don't know how long ago this started, but for I think a few years now, Memorial Drive in Cambridge has been closed on Sundays from I think April to November, just for people to hang out. And it's been a fairly successful program. And I think recently some city councilors in Cambridge as well as residents have been pushing for more Memorial Drive to be closed more often or longer throughout the week, so long as stay-at-home protocols in effect. And so, I think just an example of how cities are adjusting to this new normal, as we call it, and leveraging its assets, its capacity to provide and care for some of our needs at this time.
Yeah, great. I'm going to ask you one follow-up question because we
already
got so many questions about this, but I live in the city of Boston. I can get groceries across the street from where I live. I can walk to a park if I need to. I see the benefits of density every day. But I think, and this really speaks to our transit question, we've seen a lot of public narrative that it's safer to have a car and that transit is dirty. And should we even be talking about transit-oriented development at this time? And so can you sort of share for us what the world looks like for people right now who don't live in dense urban settings, but who have limited mobility options, either in Massachusetts or elsewhere?
the world as it looks for people who are not in dense urban settings, but still rely on transportation?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think to the extent you can, you know, we're trying to hold on to as much of normal as we possibly can. So I think for people who are essential workers, you are still getting to work the way you normally would, whether it's getting in your car and, you know, going down Route 2 or Mass Pike to get into Boston. I mean, I think the roads look a lot different these days since there's a lot less cars on the road. So I'm sure it's a much more pleasant drive, a much more, you know, a quicker drive as well. So I think, you know, that aspect of life continues. I mean, as it relates to, you know, just networking and stuff like that, I've seen a lot of footage in media of people doing drive-by whatever. So if somebody is graduating, or somebody got married, or somebody celebrating a birthday, you'll see images and videos of cars lining up on streets, people honking, hey, how you doing? You know, da 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 da. You know, it's all about you. You know, and still, you know, spending time with their loved ones, even though they can't really be in close proximity to each other. So I think people are still finding creative ways to remain connected, to still, you know, celebrate these, you know, great moments that are worth celebrating, you know, and just doing the best that they can to make it through.
Great, great. And Amy, I am going to turn things over to you now. I love asking you to sort of to pick your brain a little bit. And one thing that has really, you know, resonated for us at Livable Streets is that we keep talking about opening up, but we never closed. And that there are actually a tremendous number of people who are going to work every day, and that many of those people are actually reliant on transit. And that if they don't have a good, reliable transit option, whether it's the bus or the train, they don't have options right now. It's really challenging. And then on the flip side, you know, we have some people who are in actually like me in a really great setting. And as you and I have discussed, this sort of tale of two cities, right? This either or dichotomy didn't happen overnight. You know, this is the result of active choices, active community decisions from policymakers that have happened over several decades. And I would love for you just to give the audience some context about the policies and structures and the landscape that really created this inequitable situation. I want us to sort of dig into the history of this. So Amy, take it away.
Oh, thank you, Stacy, and thank you, Livable Streets and WGBH, for the opportunity to join this conversation. The Tale of Two Cities in Greater Boston is a complicated history. It's a braid with many threads. I've studied one of those threads, and that's zoning policy. So going back to the 1920s, cities and towns of Greater Boston began adopting zoning. Zoning bylaws and ordinances established where in the municipality different kinds of buildings could go: single-family houses, multifamily houses, offices, factories, stores. Then in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, in the era of white flight, when many people were leaving the city of Boston to go to the suburbs, people with resources were moving out to the suburbs, the newcomers to the suburbs joined the longtime residents of the suburbs in rewriting the zoning codes to make the zoning codes more restrictive, to make it harder to build multifamily housing in the suburbs, and to require very large lots to build single family houses in the suburbs. In many places in Greater Boston, you would need an acre of land or even 2 acres of land to build a single family house. And an acre of land is close to the size of a football field. So they were putting up gates around the suburbs, paper gates of regulation. Single-family houses tend to be owner-occupied, and multifamily housing offers greater rental opportunities. So if you prevent rental housing from going into certain municipalities by preventing and prohibiting multifamily housing development, then you segregate the region. First, based on income and savings of the population, but also by race, because white people have had more intergenerational wealth and savings for home buying than Black people. And we see the highly restrictive zoning I was talking about, like the 1 acre lot sizes, 2 acre lot sizes in elite suburbs like Weston and Carlisle and Marblehead and Cohasset are highly restrictive. But restrictive zoning was adopted in every municipality in Greater Boston. And this also isn't just history. The cities and towns have been renewing their restrictions, adopting new bylaws and ordinances related to zoning. Now, one of the things I found in my research is that the cities in the region tend to allow more opportunities for building multifamily housing than the towns do. And I'm thinking of cities like Malden, Quincy, and Lynn, and Waltham and Walpole, and even Newton, where I live, have been allowing more multifamily housing recently. But even those cities are very restrictive. So I was talking to a building inspector in Lynn who said to me that the lot size zoning in Lynn is aspirational. And I was like, aspirational, what does that mean? And it really meant that the required lot sizes in the zoning in Lynn to build a single family house are bigger than almost every single lot of where existing single family housing is. And we see that pattern really all across Greater Boston and the cities and towns, that they've been adopting aspirational zoning, which is really exclusionary zoning. And so to summarize today, to understand the segregation in the region by class and by race and ethnicity, one part of that is that we need to understand that cities and towns have adopted policies that keep certain groups of people out of certain suburbs and neighborhoods, shutting those people out from certain public benefits of the suburbs, such as excellent schools and safe streets and well-maintained infrastructure. That's my tale of two cities as it relates to zoning policy.
Great, thank you. And I'm gonna pull Wendell in and see if he has anything to add to just sort of tie to his first point, which is that in a well-functioning dense setting, you have all of these great services that make living in a city great and make you resilient to a public health crisis. And then you have these policies, you know, that they are incredibly inequitable, and they are purposefully inequitable to exclude certain populations. And then, you know, that is really the core of what doesn't work, or at least that's what I'm seeing between both Amy and Wendell's comments. But Wendell, do you have anything to add to what Amy said before I take us in a different direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing I would add is, yeah, I think Amy did a great job of summarizing, like, you know, this tale of two cities within the Boston context. You know, obviously it's not unique to Boston. And if you think about the, you know, mid-20th century, when the federal government, you know, poured a lot of money into creating communities across the country, you know, the policies, the programs, and the practices that enabled that were fundamentally, well, racist, right? It was extremely exclusive, it was extremely segregated communities, and, you know, we are still living with the legacy of that today. So even in dense settings, right, where you have all these, you know, wonderful assets, there are still clear inequities across the spectrum. Not all communities are equal, not all neighborhoods are equal. You know, it's funny because, you know, as an urban planner, one of the first things that you learn in urban planning is that your zip code has a considerable impact on your life trajectory, almost as much as your family history does, right? Where you're born, where you live, almost has as much say on, you know, what your options are as your family history does. And that's before you even make a decision, right? And I think that's a tacit understanding of the structural, systemic inequities and structural racism that exists in communities, you know, across the country. You know, a good friend and colleague of mine, Stephen Gray, wrote a great article on this in Next City just a few days ago, called it, you know, COVID puts on, I'm paraphrasing the title. I don't think he said COVID puts on blast. I think he said COVID puts on display structural racism. And, you know, he really just, you know, takes you through it very quickly. What I like about his article is at the end, he talks about different points within our communities, economically, housing, in terms of economics, in terms of housing, in terms of transportation, where we should target our focus and our investment to start addressing and redressing, you know, all these systemic issues that, you know, we've inherited and that we still have to deal with today.
Thank you. And I just want to thank you for making that reference, and we're going to try to dig up that next city piece as we talk. And to remind folks, already we have a ton of great resources that Amy and Wendell have both referenced in the chat. So if you want to learn more about zoning, if you want to learn more about housing, if you want to learn more about racial segregation, you can already check some of that out in the chat feed, and we're going to keep loading that as we go. You know, and I want to steal from you, and something that you brought up from us. You know, this question of your zip code impacting your existence is also true in transit, and the Livable Streets 64 Hours report also, you know, highlighted this, that Black riders on average spend 64 more hours than their white counterparts commuting. They have longer commutes, they have fewer transit options, and that is, you know, that legacy is directly related to the redlining and both of the examples that you brought up earlier. Okay, so we know how we got here. I feel like we've answered the question of density is not the problem. Inequity and racism and discrimination is the problem. But now we got to do something about it. So I'm going to shift gears and turn things back to Amy, and of course, you know, keep the conversation going. But you know, something that is just on people's minds right now is that we are almost certainly in the midst of a massive and long-term economic slowdown. And so for the last decade, we've only been thinking about housing in the context of grow, 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 fast, 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 build, build, build. And, you know, Amy, I'm going to ask you to start first and just say, how do we start thinking about building context in housing in the context of an economic slowdown? How do we reset when we're not doing this in the middle of growth?
Great. Right. We are definitely in a period of radical uncertainty. And it's why first I hesitated. Do I even want to join this call? How can we talk about the future and planning for the future when everything that we were building on now seems quite uncertain? The market's changing profoundly right now, both in terms of supply and demand. It's hard to say what this is going to look like in a year from now, or 2 years, or 5 or 10 years. We just don't know. But what we need to do is to think about different scenarios and start planning. It seems to me likely, as one scenario, that in the next couple of years, the demand for new housing construction will go down, as fewer people will have money for down payments, and 20-somethings who are out of work will move back with their parents, and elderly people will move in with their kids, and other people will take more roommates to cover rent. Will the population of college students and grad students in Greater Boston recover this year and the next couple of years? And if tourism stays down for a while, maybe Airbnbs get converted back to residential rentals, all affecting the market. Another factor to think about on the supply side is maybe the prices of construction materials go down as worldwide construction slows, but maybe we also see supply chain disruptions of certain construction materials. So there are a lot of considerations on the market side. I know these are challenging things to talk about or think about going forward. And my own expertise actually is just in zoning, which is government regulation of housing development of the construction market. Zoning does not make a market. The purpose of zoning is to guide the market. It often gets used to prevent development, but its purpose is to guide development for the public good. In a slow market, which it looks like we're approaching, we don't want for zoning to hamper economic recovery. So we should be thinking about what our zoning policies are to not stop the recovery when things start heating up and improving. And in a hot market where we've been for a while, we don't want for zoning to cause a housing shortage, sort of a do no harm of zoning. So I have several ideas about going forward under different scenarios that might happen, of important policies to put in place to plan for the future when things do improve. I've got ideas related to accessory dwelling units, town center development, and single family zoning as well. But I'm just gonna talk right now a little bit about accessory dwelling units, and I think in the Q&A or maybe further in, I can cover some of the other topics, and Wendell might cover them too. But accessory dwelling units, to start with that, they're called ADUs, and they're also known as in-law apartments or backyard cottages. those are secondary apartments inside or on the property of a single family house. So my prediction, for what it's worth, is that we'll see an increase in demand for ADUs in the coming years. Because when the economy is slow and your in-laws move in with you, or your own kids move back in, your grown kids move back in with you, you might want for them to have their own kitchen if you can afford it, and their own front door. Or if you're having a hard time making the mortgage payments, you might want to take on tenants into your single family house, but you might prefer, instead of sharing your kitchen, that they have their own kitchen and their own front door. And that's when you start thinking about building a ADU in your single family house. Now, municipal planners and housing advocates have spent decades advocating for cities and towns to allow ADUs in zoning. The recommendation is listed in most municipal master plans and housing plans going back for decades. And so after all these years of advocacy and planning for ADUs, only 37 of 100 cities and towns in Greater Boston that I surveyed allow for homeowners to put in ADUs and rent them out. Another third of the cities and towns that I surveyed allow you to put in an ADU for your relatives, but not for rental. And all of these cities and towns that do allow ADUs highly restrict them in a whole number of ways, so that very few ADUs are actually get permitted from town to town and city to city. And I found, and this is an important one, I think in the coming years, that only 16 of the 100 municipalities that I surveyed allow ADUs in detached structures. So like backyard cottages, if you wanted to put in a tiny home in your backyard that your mother-in-law would live in, or to rent out. Most of the regulations require that an accessory dwelling unit be either attached to the single family house or enclosed by it. And I think that there are many people who might put one in, but actually want the privacy and separation that a backyard cottage affords. ADUs should be allowed much more liberally now, and now really across the region. And this is a good area for local action if people are thinking about what they could do in their own communities for zoning reform. But really based on past experience, we could say that the pace of change, it could take, on the past pace of change, it could take 100 years for every municipality to allow backyard cottages. And that's why I think this is also an area for state action. The state could allow ADU development and backyard cottages right away. And this would help people to be resilient in a time of economic uncertainty. So that's my number one of several recommendations. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I know you have a whole list, but I want to turn this over to Wendell to see, you know, if I'm asking you to ask the same question, what are your sort of top one or two before I ask, you know, make us change gears again?
Yeah, no, I think Amy made a lot of great points about, you know, ways to think about, you know, development and zoning and all that kind of stuff. For me, I'm coming at it from a different angle. So I remember back in planning grad school, I took a class that was called Planning Without Growth. And the idea was to kind of like examine urban shrinkage. Now, I mean, typically we consider shrinkage in cities as population loss, but it's not just about population loss. It can refer to other things as well. And, you know, if we indeed are moving into a phase of you know, decreased or less economic activity, then I think, you know, you can make the logical assumption that growth may not be as much of a thing as we have come to expect, at least not growth at the rate that, you know, we saw in recent years. I mean, a lot of folks have said that Boston was in like an economic boom. There's cranes all over the place, right? So if economic activity slows down a bit, you may not see growth. I think of growth as something that is additive, right? Additive and a function of an upward trends of economic activity, right? So if things are going well, right, you know, we making bank, more houses, more jobs, more this, more that, good things. But if things kind of like slow down, then growth logically slows down as well. So I think that's an opportunity then to kind of like shift our focus a little bit and think about development. And so I think of development as a process of assessing and analyzing existing resources, existing assets, existing infrastructure, and making the necessary adjustments and investments that have, you know, an impact on people's day-to-day lives, you know, in the here and now. And so if we indeed are planning without growth, I think in terms of development, I think we should really think about social infrastructure. social infrastructure, which includes third spaces, right? Coffee shops, barbershops, hair salons, churches, all that good stuff. Social infrastructure that, focuses on, public facilities, libraries, community centers, places where people can continue learning, places where people can continue connecting, all that kind of stuff. These are the really, connective tissues within cities of any size, where, again, people can learn, people can grow, people can, really live together. And I think these are the things that really make a city what it is. And actually, it's one of those things where if you lose it, it is to the detriment of a city itself. So, I just, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking about some tough news that, I heard last week regarding the city of Boston's Black-owned restaurants and bars, right? So there's not a lot. In fact, the Black-owned restaurants and bars in Boston represent like less than 1% of the total restaurants and bars in Boston. And while they're all going through it, let's be clear, everybody's going through it. One of the things that we have seen during COVID is the fact that, when it comes to communities of color, things are just a little bit different. It's just a little bit harder. And so the Black-owned restaurants and bars in Boston came together, formed the Black Hospitality Coalition, and put out a press release calling, speaking to the state of emergency of Boston's Black-owned restaurants and bars, basically saying, if things keep up, we're not going to make it. And I mean, we're talking about, these are institutions, community institutions that have, I think, over like 180 years under their belt. And we're talking about, a significant piece of Boston, not just, yes, Black Boston, but Boston that could be lost forever. That's, I can't put into words, how much of a tragedy that would be. And so I think development is thinking about how to preserve these cultural assets, how to preserve these economic assets that not only put people to work, that not only provide people a way to provide for their families and for themselves, but they also give something back to their community. A space people can go, listen to some good music, as I love to do, meet people, learn, all that kind of stuff. And so I think in an age where we may be planning without growth, I think we should really plan for development and really look to existing assets and do what we can to, really buffer them and shore them up so that they can continue to, just be what makes cities great.
Awesome. Thank you. And I'm going to do my job to connect the dots and then move us again, because we're already getting close to time, but just two reflections. One, I think there's this amazing synergy where, our main streets depend on density. Like if you don't have people to show up to the main street, then the main street doesn't exist, but our density depends on the main streets. And I would point folks to our second street talk that focused on streets and open streets, but also this deep disparity between how our communities of color are being impacted versus our white communities. Because, I've had conversations with business leaders who are like, yeah, we really want that extra street space to open our restaurant if we can even open again. And that we have to make that connection, right? That, we know that in Boston right now, our white business owners are set up better in many cases, not universally. My businesses that I love around the corner are struggling, but that there is this disparity. And so those open streets aren't going to serve businesses that can't open. And we know that our Black and brown businesses are struggling more right now. So it is all just so connected. And if this is the first time you guys are tuning in, like I said, go back. We got 3 hours of content that builds up this conversation for you. Okay, shifting gears. I have one more question for both of you, and then we're going to turn things over to Bob Seay, who's going to ask us all some questions. So my very last question, which some folks have asked, some audience have asked similar questions around this, is just, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that even today and for many years, we've straight up needed to build more affordable and specifically deeply affordable housing, whether for renters or people who can buy. And that need isn't going to go away and is likely going to increase. So when we're talking about policy mechanisms to build deeply affordable housing, what does that look like and what can we do? And I'm going to turn it over to Amy again to set us up. And then Wendell, we got about 3 minutes for this conversation, and we'll turn things over to Bob.
I'm happy to let Amy handle this.
Great. Amy, you take it, and then we'll ask Bob to jump in.
Okay. So We as a region have not built much deeply affordable public housing in many decades. Our main strategy to gain affordable housing, to get deed-restricted affordable units, has been to require builders of market rate developments to include affordable units in their market, along with their market rate units. So you see projects in Greater Boston where 90% of the units are market rate and 10% are affordable because the regulations required that inclusion of affordability, or 80% market rate and 20% affordable. And those affordable units are typically priced to be affordable by certain formulas to households making 80% of area median income. But in Greater Boston, area median income is actually very high. And those affordable units can go for rents like $1,600 or $1,800, which is super cheap for new construction in Greater Boston to get a new apartment, but it's hardly affordable to people earning minimum wage or on fixed incomes. We haven't been able to build deeply affordable public housing for a lack of funding, a lack of a major federal initiative. The cost of construction is simply like way too high for the market to build these kinds of deeply affordable units without public funding. And people have been talking recently about the recent federal spending, calling it stimulus, and it really isn't stimulus. The recent spending is really funding. It's social protection, it's economic protection. Stimulus will come later, and when we try to restart the economy in earnest. Stimulus should be an opportunity to build public housing. So this is actually a great opportunity for us. It's an opportunity in a crisis. And our charge right now should be to begin planning for it. So when that funding comes through, we've got projects that are ready to go. And the challenge for us politically will be to find locations for that public housing, mixed income housing with deeply affordable units in village centers or near and walking distance to the historic downtowns of the region, where there are sidewalks and there are institutions, places that aren't isolated in various hinterlands, which is really where we sent public housing in the past. The last time we had a large public initiative at public housing development, we really isolated public housing, which really was a devastating thing for the residents to be disconnected from so many opportunities in the region. We need to plan at this time to do better.
Awesome. So thank you, Amy. And again, to connect the dots for folks, we did talk about this difference between stimulus versus just sort of backfilling the coffers right now in our First Street talk around transit. But I think, too, as we're thinking about what housing stimulus might look like, it's really important for folks who care about these issues to get caught up and think about how we can be talking to our legislators right now. And then using whatever money we get in the ways that are going to have the best benefit, which it sounds like I'm hearing good main streets, good density, transit-oriented development, perhaps, which I know we have questions in the Q&A for. But we're already 40 minutes in, and I want to do what we've been doing every time, which is turn the tables and invite Bob Seay, who's a reporter with WGBH, to hop into the conversation with us and ask us some questions. And Bob, I'm not seeing your, oh, there you are.
There we are.
Bob,
Okay.
take it
Yes.
away.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to talk about two things, and one centers around the Fairmont line, which I did quite a bit of work on a couple of years ago, realizing that when you provide transit, you also run the risk of gentrification because the property values suddenly go up and people can't afford to live there. I attended an affordable housing dedication at Fairmont with Mayor Walsh, and is it Sheila Dillon? Is that his housing person? Mm-hmm. And so I said, so what are you going to do about this problem of people, not being able to afford to stay where they're living right now? And she said, well, unfortunately, the only thing we can do is build more of these. And she pointed to the affordable housing complex because we do not have rent control. There's no protection for people against this market force. Now that may change with what's going on with the economy, but what are the chances of seeing some kind of rent control to preserve the places where people are living? And Amy or Wendell, either one of you can take that on.
Wendell, I'll let you start.
Wow. that's a good question, man. I know. I mean, I'm a transplant. I'm not from Boston. I've kind of like just learned about Boston during my time here. So I know rent control, was done away with back in the early 90s, if I'm not mistaken. And it as recently as last year, it's a question that kind of like came back up again. I know it's a very contentious one. There's folks on both sides who have strong arguments both for and against it. I really can't speak to the likelihood of rent control being a thing again in the near future. But I mean, I do understand there is really a need to really think about how people are impacted by investment. And, it really ties back to, the comments that were made earlier around systemic inequities and structural racism, right? I mean, a whole bunch of policies and practices and programs that have played out and have spatial implications, and we're still dealing with that today. I mean, I think, whether it's rent control or something else, in terms of protecting people from investment, I think it's really, you have to think about how do you see to it that advantages and disadvantages of investment are shared equally, or at least equitably. I don't know that the solution is hard. I do think it is somewhat difficult because you have to be intentional about redirecting capital and investing it in places where it is needed most. To be able to keep folks in place and not have them be displaced by investment, then you have to invest in ways that people can remain in place. Now, historically, we've known that to be home ownership, right? If I own my property, if I, have, a right to this land, then, whatever happens, I can benefit from it. And so, I mean, I think home ownership is a big key to that. And I know there are plenty of first-time home buyer programs across the region that are really trying to help people not only benefit economically from all that this region has to offer, but also be lifelong residents here, should they choose to be. So that's kind of my response to that question.
I might have an answer to that, or an idea, or something I just want to draw on from what Amy said, which is that what we've observed around, Fairmont Line and rent control is that it is much like this conversation, not is it good, yes or bad, but how is it implemented? And I think that, there are examples from cities like Berlin where they said, we're going to do rent control for 5 years. We know this isn't a good long-term policy. We're going to use it in sort of an exact way to solve a very specific problem. And so I would say that we believe that rent control should be one of the tools that is being considered, but we need to be exacting about how we would implement and use that tool.
Mm-hmm. And Amy, when affordable, quote, affordable housing is built, what does that mean? How is it kept affordable?
The affordable units have deed restrictions on them about what the rent can be set at, or if they're resale units, there are formulas about what the resale price can be or how much it can increase from what it last sold for. And those deed restrictions can last 30 years or longer.
The second subject I wanted to talk about was telecommuting. People now, most people are working from home, and people are finding out that they can work from home. In fact, maybe they can work from anywhere. They have a laptop and Wi-Fi. So I've been talking to some families who are saying, gee, why are we living in crowded Boston when with our children we could move where we, number one, have more space, and number two, more house for the money. And I think this is something, I don't know how much of this we're going to see, but certainly the culture, the cultivation of this, this incentive to move out of the city is something that especially young families are really thinking about. And how do you counter that, or do you see that as inevitable?
Well, a lot of people are saying that this time period that we're in right now marks like the triumph of the single family house over multifamily housing. And I think that's nonsense. First of all, we could never house the world's population or even greater Boston's population in single family houses with yards, and especially with large yards. It's just impossible. Also, single family housing is not for everyone, and dense settlement has many public benefits relative to sprawling development. So we need multifamily family housing now and in the future. But that said, I can imagine a scenario in the next few years where there's an uptick in the market for single family housing. Like you're talking about, people can telecommute. If they go into the office only 3 days a week, they might put up with a longer commute because they're spending more time at home. Another factor is that millennials are starting to have kids, and they were driving some of the market for downtown condos, and maybe they're now getting more interested in moving further from the city to have a yard. And another factor perhaps, and we don't know how this will play out, that people who bought downtown condos might now feel an itch to have a yard after this experience and try and join that market to the extent that they are able to, given the economic situation, but after lockdown. So the market is changing, and I could very well imagine an uptick in demand for single family housing. And I think that in the inner suburbs, there's just not a lot of room for a lot of new single family houses, but we could allow through the zoning more townhouse development. And a lot of people who are looking for single family houses also find townhouses appealing, where you can exit your house right to a yard, although there's just another house attached by one wall or on your sides. So doing that is a way of providing housing that's similar. Satisfies the need that people have when they're looking for a single family house. Further out from Boston, there's more room for single family subdivision. Right now, most of those areas that that could be subdivided are under zoning for very large lot subdivision. And we could do more to revise the zoning to enable clustering of houses, development of smaller houses on smaller lots and walkable neighborhoods. And the zoning could be reformed to add in provisions for something called cluster zoning, open space residential design, or conservation subdivision. It comes through a lot of names. And some places have provisions for that, others don't. And some that have it written in ways that it rarely gets used, and they could revise it and improve it. And that's something for people to think about in the further out suburbs. If there's going to be development pressure for single family houses, is to take a look at that zoning in the coming years.
And also, if we increase commuter rail frequency and quality, that will also encourage people not to stay in the city. So those are trends.
Yeah, that's been I know folks have been talking about that for a long time, not just the increase of, public transit in general, but certainly the commuter rail with folks coming out from neighboring communities, but also density around commuter rail stations as well has been a topic of conversation, and allowing multifamily zoning, multifamily development around commuter rail stations so that, more folks can enjoy, the comforts of suburban life, but also be able to get into the city efficiently.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you both. And it's a fascinating discussion, and a lot is going to unfold, obviously, over the next few months. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bob. And this conversation actually leads into where I wanted to go next, and where a ton of I think I've seen the most questions out of all of our conversations. But we have a lot of questions around gentrification and displacement, and just building on what Bob said. The question of if you're going to move to the suburb is a very privileged question. Like, that's for a person who has the money and the means to move to the suburbs in the first place. And building on everything you said tonight, Amy and Wendell, we do not want to repeat history, right? We don't want to have this reversal where people continue not to have good access to transit, not to have access to good social fabric and services in urban settings. And we sort of reprioritize a universe where that paper wall holds, it provides safety for those who have means while others are left behind. And so I'm going to try to encapsulate what is 5 or 6 questions and just say, we have a lot of questions around how do we make transit-oriented development, prevent, what are good measures for displacement, particularly around TOD, but not exclusively. How do we sort of knit together this question of making sure people have good access to assets, but make the housing affordable? And, Amy, you touched on this earlier, but I know you have some other thoughts, and Wendell as well. So yeah, let's address it head on.
Well, displacement has been really a heartbreaking issue in Greater Boston for a long time. And I've looked at places like where they were revitalizing areas in downtown Lynn or in Framingham, where the centers were gaining a lot of new development and the stores and restaurants were doing really well. But the thing that seemed so concerning was as those places become more appealing and people move in a tight housing market, the rents and sales prices of housing could continue to escalate in those areas and displace people. And there really haven't been a lot of great tools for managing that. One thing I've been pushing for, of course, is increasing supply of housing in the region to meet demand, to reduce some of that pressure on housing prices. But that is a hard thing. But I feel like recently the world has changed dramatically, and the issues that we're going to be dealing with going forward have changed dramatically, and that the whole housing advocacy community right now is looking at issues with emergency rent payments and helping people with cash support to stay in their homes. Yeah, Wendell, I have some more things I could talk about in terms of development around town centers, but I'll hand it over to Wendell for some comments too.
Great, and Wendell, this is building on that, but I'm going to try to sort of pull in one of the more nuanced questions, which you may be able to speak to, or you can say whatever you're planning on saying. But we had a follow-up question. Would not the gentrification market impacts around areas like Fairmont or Nubian Square be less if we were building more affordable housing in communities like Newton and Brookline and other wealthier areas? So this question of, is it just about that community? Is it about this relationship between the sort of wealthier white communities? Any answers to that question?
The gentrification question is a very, very loaded one. I mean, that in of itself is an hour-long conversation. Even then, it probably wouldn't be enough. I'd say, gentrification is a function of capital, and capital is fundamentally inequitable. And so a very simple answer is, if capital were to be less inequitable, gentrification would likely be less of a problem. Again, because the advantages and disadvantages of capital would be shared equally. The nature of capital, how it is accessed, how it is moved, when is it moved, where does it go, all that kind of stuff is not equal. I mean, we see a lot of people, we see the same kinds of people making the same kind of decision because they have all the capital, and the rest of us are just like, so, where do we fit in? If that were not the case, then gentrification wouldn't, I don't think it would be necessarily gentrification, it would be economic activity. And so it's, with that said, it's difficult to say, well, if there were more of a specific type of housing, we would have less of a problem. I think I'm a fan of diversity in a particular community. So, having mixed incomes, having mixed this, having mixed that, as a way of really having a holistic, sound ecosystem. I think having too much of one, not enough of another is never really a good thing. So no, I don't think I'm not saying, while I'm all for affordable housing, I'm not saying more affordable housing would necessarily be less of a problem. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that, and I wish I could have a better response to that question now. Unfortunately, I do not. I don't know who asked the question, but if you want to email me or something like that, I could try to think about it some more, give a better answer. Man, justification. Yeah, that's the best I could do right now. I'm so sorry.
Okay. No, but I think it speaks to, sometimes people say, why is Livable Streets talking about housing? And we're like, well, housing is connected to transit and transit is connected to housing. You can't have one with the other. And I think that this reality, from everyone I talk to who works on displacement issues, access to capital, access to resources are at the root of these disparities to begin with. And so we can't assume that there is no magic number of affordable housing. It is an ecosystem. There are some great links to an anti-displacement toolkit that were just put in the chat. Questions, there's I'm sure for some people, a provocative piece about why we need reparations in Black America that someone just threw into the chat. These are pieces of the conversation that we need to start expanding on, even if we can't answer them tonight.
you know, at the top of the talk, you know, I mentioned capacity, and how capacity is really the lever that lets you know how things are going in a particular city or particular community. And I think capacity might be a way of really, again, capacity being, you know, the collection of resources, of assets, of infrastructure relative to people living in a specific area. So if you really want to think about, you know, what the needs of Nubian Square in Boston are, for example, then you really have to take a step back and examine, okay, well, who's around here in Roxbury, right? How much space are we talking about? And what are the needs of people? And do we have these assets? Do we have these resources? I think then you might be able to tackle that a little bit better because you're grounded in, okay, what's going on here right now? Because what's happening in Nubian Square will probably be a lot different than, you know, Common Square, for example, in Dorchester, or any kind of square anywhere else in Boston. I think you really have to, it's always got to be contextual. Always has to be contextual. Planning is extremely contextual. It is an art, it is a science, but it is always contextual. And I think we have to be careful not to yes, we can talk about these things, but not to, when it comes down to doing the work, it can't be general. It has to be extremely, extremely well informed by what's going on right here, right now.
I'm going to ask one more question. And I would say, I saw the number of questions come through on this. I know we didn't answer every corner of it. Maybe we'll have a future street talk just on this topic if folks are interested. But we did have a set of questions that were coming back to where we started, which does density have an impact on infectious disease? What about, is it safe? You know, we've talked about third spaces tonight. We've talked about all of this stuff. We did get questions about should we stay off of public transit? I would direct people to our street talk from last week. The answer is no, and I'm very optimistic about transit. But yeah, I just want to come back and ask you guys to close on this question of fear around public health and what is reasonable, and just sort of real talk, and share your closing thoughts tonight on the value density, the real risks, and yeah.
I would leave it to the epidemiologists what's safe in the current moment in terms of riding transit and what you do if you're in an apartment building and you're going to take the elevator down, what kind of protections we want, and what it means if you're in a multi-generational family, and how to protect your other family members if you've been out in the world so that they don't get COVID. Those are big and important questions really for public health experts. But I think that in this moment, we don't know when this current crisis will be passed, when there's going to be a vaccine or wide-scale immunity or other treatments. I don't have a sense on timeline of it, or if the virus mutates, or is this the beginning of, I don't even want to talk about, are there going to be future pandemics coming our way that changes in the long run how we need to plan cities to be safe, or is this sort of this one-time event and it's not going to happen for many years again? I think that if we think about this as an event that's not going to happen just as it is right now for some time, people love their cafes, they love the public libraries, they want the freedom that they get from having a robust public transit system. They like getting on their bikes and riding on bike lanes, and that we can think about, we're going to need cities. This is not the end of all urban living, even if it's a very scary moment that we're in, and that cities are resilient. And there may be some architectural solutions to future housing development that'll keep people safe in future pandemics. But we could think about now, start planning in this slowdown for what we want our cities to look like. And I think that just 2 months ago, when I was doing presentations about zoning, people were saying this is happening too fast. We've got these proposals for housing development. We don't have the zoning in place to shape them the way we want. We don't have the infrastructure built up in places the way we want to serve them. So this big development coming is going to be a car-oriented development. And now we've been afforded some time to plan. Not a lot of time, because a lot of us are now dealing with the emergency and not able to plan for the future, but some people now do have some time to think about how we use the stimulus. I was talking before about using it for development of public housing and deeply affordable housing units. We can also use the stimulus to be building up new infrastructure and thinking about bike lanes and how we use our rivers in the region in some different ways, and how we think about public transportation and rapid bus transit and our train system, all to sort of reshape how we build our cities. So that's a lot of things we can be thinking about in the long term, informed by the pandemic, but not just based in fear of what we can do this moment with a big picture perspective.
Wendell, anything to add before I wrap it up?
Yeah, I mean, real quick, I think it's easy to point at density, as we have pointed at density in the past, and just say, see, that's density is the bad guy here. But I think it really takes you away from the conversation, the root of the issue. I think while there's while we should have critical conversations about density, how much is enough, I think we also should have a conversation about all the other things that are necessary in any kind of place where people are living that, again, are in service to the general public welfare. So I'm thinking about healthcare systems. I'm thinking about labor laws and a whole bunch of other stuff that I think are super important. And a lot of times, at least in planning conversations, don't necessarily come in because we think, well, yeah, that's a conversation for epidemiologists or public health officials or whatever, whomever, to talk about. But I mean, I think we have to be clear on what the issue really is and what the solutions are. To say to have density be the scapegoat, I think, is disingenuous when there are really, really important critical conversations to be had about the healthcare system in America, really critical conversations to be had around labor laws in America, right? The fact that people are still going to work sick because there's not enough PTO, or they don't want to burn PTO because they were trying to go on vacation, or stuff like that puts a lot of people at risk that have become commonplace, in our general, 9-to-5 life, that are actually wildly problematic, and so on and so forth. So let's not let these things off the hook. Yes, let us have critical, a targeted discussion about density, but let's also be clear that there are a whole bunch of other things that need to be on the table as well, that need to be addressed, that need to be, a little bit more progressive and a little bit more, in service of people, right? And let that be part of the discussion as well. Let's not just say, density, and then just, head to the suburbs.
I think we're going to leave it at that. Thank you so much, Amy and Wendell, for rounding out our series. In many ways, was sort of one of the hardest topics. And I know this is an evolving conversation. I just want to, again, take a moment to thank WGBH Forum, to thank Great Neighborhoods, which will soon be a partner and part of Livable Streets. You're going to hear more about these issues from Livable Streets directly in the months to come. And thank you to all of you. I know that there are several folks tonight who've been with us through all the street talks. I've seen lots of buzz on social media already. So thank you for engaging in this conversation. A street talk is really about having a talk. So thank you, and have a great night. I'm sure we will see you all soon, maybe on Zoom, but I hope in a park or in a cafe soon. Goodbye.